Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Let me just share here with the group. Bismillahi walhamdulillahi wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So we continue with the book Al-Insaf fi bayan sabab al-ikhtilaf. The word insaf in the Arabic language is a very interesting word in that it means being equitable or fair, balanced. And so for a person to be munsif is for a person to give each thing is right. And so the book is entitled Al-Insaf. So Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi is basically saying that this is a treatise which is clarifying the reason why you find differences among the scholars and in the early generation or early generations. But at the same time, it's an effort to give everything its right, its due place without exceeding the boundaries. Right? So in this case, Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi is showing us how to approach differences. It's not just a matter of people differing and people trying to overcome one another with their positions. But Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi is saying that there's more that's going on, that if we really want to understand differences, the causes of differences, then we have to give each thing its due. And that means there's a certain type of character that we have to have intellectually and emotionally when it comes to study. But also this is a good way to train ourselves in how we deal with people, right? That when it comes to differences of opinion, there's always an underlying cause as to why there's difference. And so for us to be munsif and to clarify the rationale or the reason, the causes of why there's differences, then what's necessary is for us to be patient enough and systematic enough, clear enough in our mind to go through what needs to be researched. People's statements, are they clear, unclear? Is the information accurate? Can the information be understood in a number of different ways? There's that reality that's there, that's that process that has to be undertaken in order for us to come to a point of clarity as to what's going on. And so in that case, Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi is teaching us the whole concept of being munsif. Munsif, to be a person that is fair, equitable, gives everything its due proportion, is just, especially when it comes to these types of situations of dealing with differences. Alhamdulillah. So here, Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi, now we get into the whole issue of the formation of the madhab. We started talking about that a little bit in the last session. We said that the madhab emerged in the time of the tabi'een. They start to emerge. There were plenty of madhabs. It wasn't only four. There were a number of different madhab, and they were plentiful. Let's pause for a minute on that point. One of the reasons why only four madhabs survived, became popular, because there's other madhabs which exist in today's time. But those that became popular out of the four was because there was a movement to preserve the knowledge on the part of the students. Sometimes there was government support, In the case of the Maliki Madhab and in the case of the Hanafi Madhab, both of those madhabs, their scholars reach political power. The Hanafi Madhab was one of the first madhabs to send people to the court system. And so all of that contributed to the shelf life, so to speak, to the standing of the madhab to its existence. The Maliki Madhab, it also reached the court system. And it was a madhab which governed governments. That's a reality. The Shafi madhab didn't really have that political oomph. It reached the court system, but didn't really reach like the opportunity to govern large spaces in which people reside in, and so on and so forth. But the Shafi madhab was extraordinary or extraordinaire in how they codified and how they systematized and how they organized their positions, right? And that's something that's very important to understand. They have the statements of the Imam Shafi'i, rahmatullahi alayh. It's very easy to identify them and separate them out from what it is that is the statements of other Imams or the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the Hanafi madhab, you don't have that as well. Sometimes things are attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayh, and I would like to say that in my thinking, even though it may have some limitations, I think that, for instance, we say the Shafi'i madhab, or the Maliki madhab, or the Hanbali madhab, or the Hanafi madhab. And sometimes we'll say, in the Shafi'i madhab, the Shafi'i school is this. Well, there's that allowance. How can the Shafi'i school in the 2000s or in the 1900s, I'm just using the general calendar and the later day Hijri calendar, I should say, to be a little more correct. How could that be the position of Imam Shafi'i? It's not directly the position of Imam Shafi'i, but is an outgrowth. Whatever is contemporary position today is not the position of Imam Shafi'i. So it's attributed to Imam Shafi'i in an honorary sense, in the sense of Imam Shafi'i was the founder of the school. So it's attributed indirectly, although it's known that the scholars in the madhab may disagree with their imam. So I like to make the same argument because a lot of times people like to bash the Hanafi madhab, or they're too extreme in their commitment to it. The same thing, when it comes to the Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, his statements. Sometimes things are attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa, and really because Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, because the way his methodology was one in which he conducted investigations by consultation. He would, if there was like a session of knowledge, he had a number of different prominent students that were grounded in different sciences, and they would have a discussion as a jama'ah. And that's the minhaj of the Salaf. You find that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he did the same thing with the leading companions. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, he would consult all of them, and then they will come to kind of like a group decision. So sometimes it may be the case that something is attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, but in reality is the position of the Jama'ah. So that's not, I mean, even in recent times, I don't find that to be much of a big deal. I think in today's time, because of the way that we have to realize that in Western scholarship, doesn't always match with the same spirit in Muslim scholarship or Islamic scholarship. So we shouldn't always apply, because we grew up in the West, we shouldn't always apply the Western standard to the Muslim scholarship community. If we want to understand how it works, especially in the past, right? We have to learn how to identify the systems. Then we can, be a little more mature in how we deal with these types of issues. There's sometimes like on some things in Islamic scholarship, there's a push for extreme accuracy, especially when it deals with the issues of the Quran, when it deals with the issues of the Hadith, when it deals with issues of like judgment, like judgments in the court system. There's a push for extreme accuracy, detailed accuracy. And then there's some things like, for instance, with history, there's a push for accuracy, but there's also some room, some flexibility. It is you. That's why you have, like, for instance, even when you try to reconstruct eyewitness accounts, you're taking so many things into consideration. You were not there, so even if you had a camera, that doesn't mean you can understand the whole dynamics. So there's kind of a little bit of flexibility in gathering information in that type of scenario of reconstructing history. So some things are understood in Islamic scholarship, like for instance, how to deal with knowledge. If you're from the outside, you won't understand how that works. It's just like a Muslim dealing with a non-Muslim, and a Muslim is used to using the right hand, shaking hands with the right hand, drinking with the right hand. That code of the right hand may not be known to the outsider. So the outsider, if, like, say for instance, if 1 minute I have the bottle of water in my left hand, then when I'm drinking in the right hand, I'm drinking with the right hand. For an outsider, they may not understand the logic behind it, right? But for another Muslim, that's a natural thing. They understand the process, right? They understand the process is an insider knowledge. So there's things like that in Islamic scholarship as well when it comes to attributing positions to the Imams. So when it comes to how you deal with knowledge, there's insider knowledge and outsider knowledge. It's not an issue of secrecy. It's just an issue of experience. It's the issue of being part of that crowd, being part of the expertise crowd. And so going back to the point, the formation of the madhab, they emerged out of the need to deal with the knowledge that came before and deal with it systematically. And so the madhab, they matured on that premise. They matured on the premise of what the Quran says, what the Prophet has said, what were the fatwas of the early generation, what were the judgments. And we mentioned that there's a difference between fatwa and judgment. I'm not going over that again right now, other than to say that fatwa is not issued in a court system. Judgment is issued in a court system. And so you imagine the differences between those two types of things. That one is binding, one is not binding. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow the fatwa. It just means that one has power behind it. And so that's about all that I'm going to say with that. So the fatawa, which is the plural fatwa, right? The judgments, that came out of the court system. The different ideas about research methodology and how to deal with the Arabic language. All of this knowledge is like, this is knowledge which can be considered knowledge in itself, knowledge of the Arabic language, knowledge of research, knowledge of what the companion said, knowledge of hadith, knowledge of what the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Knowledge of hadith and what the Prophet said are two different things, in the sense that the hadith is how do you deal with statements. Hadith knowledge is how do you deal with statements of the Prophet, how do you deal with them, and then the prophetic statements are what the Prophet said, maybe what he did, that type of thing. So all of these different pockets of knowledge had to be organized and brought together. And so what happens, like when people get good at things, they begin to organize, they begin to systematize, they begin to refine, they begin to develop a method. And so the early generation, unlike ourselves, was very, when it came to Islamic knowledge, was very methodical. And that's why and they had projects. Projects is like a contemporary term, But they usually say in Arabic now mashru'at. Even Sheikh Al-Aini, Al-Launi, Sharif Al-Auni, he said that every student should have a project that they're working on that's being developed and takes years. And then, and you see that example in what? In Bukhari and Imam Malik, the Muwatta, which was one of the first codified books of Hadith that exists. It was a process. It took time. So you find those early scholars, they had these projects that they worked on. And in that, they collected the statements of the companions. They collected the ideas of what they thought on issues. They collected a hadith, and they organized this around the Quran. And they had these systematized projects. And so you find that that's how the madhab formed. The madhab formed by following imams, and then the students come and they systematize, they organize, and they kind of stay on the same system, and they just keep building on it, building on it, building on it, working together. And then from there you have the growth of the madhab. And so in time, what happens is that there's going to be differences of opinion on how things are seen. It could be a difference that's intellectual, in the sense of a point in the Arabic language, a point in Hadith, a point in Quran, or it can be empirical, in the sense that it may have something to do with the time and place that they're living in. So there's issues in today's time which they didn't have to deal with back then. And so, for instance, you can have the same scholars of one school differ. That's just the bottom line. Not based on any methodological point. It has nothing to do with the hadith, has nothing to do with the Arabic language, has nothing to do with the Quran, has nothing to do with a research point. It just the case. It could be the same case, same type of situation in two different contexts. Two different contexts. So you find differences of opinion, based on the application in a particular context. And that's something that I want you to focus on. That differences of opinion can be a matter of a position applied to a certain situation. It could be the same case in one part of the world and in another part of the world, because of the context, because of what's going on, the ruling may differ. And so that's what you find, that the madhab, they organize all that knowledge. And that's the simplest way I think I can put it, that the madhab organize all of that knowledge. And so they are going to differ. So Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi says that after, in the early generations, what begins to happen is that they focus on certain type of a hadith, right? So the Musnad tradition, the Mursal tradition, and I'm not going to go into the details of all of that, other than to say that the Mursal is a hadith, and a hadith consists of two things. Consists of a text and a chain of transmission. Who said it? Where did it come from? Like references, reference notes. What sources did it come from? That type of content, that type of concept. So each chain in the chain of transmission is a person, is a source. And so a musnad narration, it means that it goes all the way back without break. The mursal, it means that it has a break. A mursal is a certain type of break. And I'm not going to get into that with a lot of detail, other than to say that in general, what you find in the books of hadith sciences is that they say that the mursal is the tabi'in relating directly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, leaving out the companion. That's not always the case. That's the standard definition. There's detail to that, but I'll leave that point. Ali, what were you saying? With the issue, I caught some of the message. The issue with the Quran, issue with the Arabic language, and different in matters of understanding, is that there's some things which are clear in the language, and then there's other things which we say يحتمل, right? And so there's a possibility of understanding it in multiple ways. And it's not just an issue of you see it your way, I see it my way. It's not an issue of that. I hope that's clear. It's not an issue of your perspective, my perspective. It's not an issue of that. What it is that the standard in the Arabic language, the usage, how it's used, that goes back to the usage of the Arabic speaking community of old, not today, of old. And that goes back, for the most part, to a portion of Jahiliyyah, time wise. And it goes back to a couple generations of Islam. And then it stops. That bracketed time, those generations that I just mentioned, they become the standard reference points for the Arabic language usage. So they're like the model of the Arabic language, how they use the language. So sometimes, but especially when we talk about the time of Jahiliyyah, sometimes the Arabs use the word that can have multiple meanings. Just like in English, we have the word bad. In the past, even there was a poem or a rap song where Rum DMC says, bad meaning bad, not bad meaning good. You know, and so that that shows you that even in the language, there's two ways of using the word bad. It could mean good, like, wow, that was bad. It could, is you're accentuating a point, you're highlighting a point of beauty that you liked it, or it could be, that tastes bad. So you have that in the language, right? But the thing about in the Arabic language is that there's a standard. That standard is how those people used the words, not how we think we want to use it. See, in the English language, we're constantly, it's American English, we're constantly generating new words. And those words have no root in grammar. They have no, we just make up stuff. And so sometimes we're judging from that reality, even without knowing it. So perspective, sometimes it comes from that angle that, people make stuff up. That's the way I see it. You know what I'm saying? It's not really based on anything. It's just sometimes that's, how I feel about it. But that's not what's going on here. So sometimes in the Arabic language, like for instance, when the issue comes up of the word ayn, the word ayn has multiple meanings, more than one. It can mean gold. It can mean basically a pond or pool of water. It can mean a spy. It can mean the eye, right? There's the heart of a thing. It can mean a lot of different things. And so, for instance, like you have that type of thing, a Pali semi word, when it comes to the issue of nikah. The term nikah, it has two different meanings. One, it means the actual contract of marriage, and the other means the act of sexual intimacy. So you have two meanings for the word nikah. The word qur in the Arabic language. It can mean impurity or purity. It has opposite meanings that come into it. And so you have some of that stuff in the English language, but the difference is that in the English language, there's no standard. Words can change meaning over time. In the Arabic language, the standard usage is what I pointed out. Either there's a period in the time of Jahiliyyah in which the Arabic is a reference point. We look back to that period to try to understand words that may not be clear to us. So in the Quran, sometimes you have a word that can open up to multiple meanings. So it's not just an issue of perspective, it's an issue of how was it used among the Arabs. So for instance, it's not typical that I use this plastic bottle that is right now is a water bottle. It's not typical that I take this and I pour soda into it or pop into it, right? And then I store it for days. It can be used like that, but it's not typical, right? It's not typical. People may use this bottle for different things, but it's not typical that they're going to, use this as a cup on a regular daily basis. It's kind of difficult, and it's not the material for that, right? It's a little soft. So, but you have standard cups. So that's the issue of what's typical, what's standard, that type of concept. And so sometimes the differences that you find in tafsir or in understanding hadith, when it just comes to the issue of the Arabic language, goes back to that. Right, goes back to that. And so there has to be a proof to support why it is that you are using the language in that way. And I said all of that to say that at the end of the day, you have to have a shahid, you have to have a proof, you have to have a witness, you have to have a testimony, you have to have something that is going to back up your usage. You just can't make stuff up. So differences in the Quran when it comes in the Sunnah, when it comes to the Arabic language, that's one of the points. The other point of difference is that someone may say, your hadith is sound, but the chain is mursal, right? And so I'm not going to accept the hadith because there's a break in it. Yeah, you can prove that there's no one that's a liar in the hadith, but the chain is not connected all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so sometimes they will differ over that type of thing, the chain of transmission. Sometimes they will differ over the chain of transmission, right? And what types of hadith that are acceptable and what types of hadith that are not acceptable to them. So because they want a high degree or high standard of integrity and veracity, truthfulness. And so sometimes the scholars will put aside a narration, although it's sound and is acceptable, like the Mursal tradition, and only go with the tradition that is called Marfu' or Musnad, is connected all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's no breaks in the chain. That's from their meticulousness. So you find other scholars, and this was mentioned in the last session, they would rather preserve the statements of the Imams, their teachers that came before them, and use them as their teaching and educating and as proofs because they confided and they trusted in the truthfulness of their teachers. So they didn't want to make a mistake when it came to the ahadith. And so sometimes you find that they use their teachers' positions, as almost as proofs. And so sometimes you find that the position that they reach or the conclusion that they reach on an issue, they reach a conclusion that may differ from another school because they were going with what their imam said. Whereas the other school may say, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the hadith in this case because we are clear that the chain of transmission is sound. And so we have this hadith here, so there's no need for us to go with the position of the imam, what the imam had said, because we don't have the evidence, right, to trace this back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but based on what the Imam said. But we have a hadith which shows us what the Prophet said, and that's kind of like today's time. The best example of that is what you find with the Maliki Method. The Maliki Method, you find you have the Hadith, right, in the Muwatta that's indicating somewhat to the hands being held like this in the prayer. But in the practice of the Madhab, you find that the hands are to the side. And so some people say, well, look, regardless of what you guys are saying, we have a hadith here that says uh, the folding of the hands or indicates to that reality, right? And so, because that's an issue which is a little open to different understandings. And so you find some will go with the position of the position that is attributed to the imam, because we're not. That's another issue. The attribution of a position to an imam and the actual position of the imam. And we talked about that a little earlier. And so that's one of the reasons you find that the madhab they differ over that type of stuff. It's not that people are against the sunnah, or it's not that people are negligent of the sunnah. That's not a correct approach to look at the issue. What it is that the scholars of Islam were very meticulous. They were very systematic. They usually didn't work by themselves. They worked in groups. And so in working in groups, that brings a certain dynamic to it. The group, there's that group feeling. And so the madhab, they begin to take on their identity. They begin to, yeah, this is our imam. Yeah, this is our school. And they have some feelings about that. They have some feelings about that, and they have a commitment to the deen. Remember that time period was not like our time period. That's a time period where people grew up, and they don't grow up with major sins being exposed in the society. There's no distraction of the telephone, no distraction of the internet, no distraction of TV. There's there's no distraction of being up all night, 24 hours a day, because there's lights. So they had a different type of lifestyle. They had a lifestyle which was focused. It wasn't all over the place. It was very focused, and it was focused on their practice of the deen. Their life and their deen came together. And so you have a people that they have, you know, uh, an orientation in Islam. Not to say that we don't have an orientation in Islam, but what I'm saying is that, and it's not to idealize them, what I'm saying is that those environments reflected the deen. That's why Sheikh Sayyid Nursi, rahmatullahi alayhi, from the ulama of Turkey, he wrote something about ijtihad, or people coming up with their own research in the deen based on the principles of Islamic research. And he said in the past it was a lot different because the people lived and breathed Islam. So they grew up with a strict familiarity of the Quran. They grew up with an understanding of the Arabic language. They grew up with an understanding of a hadith. They grew up seeing the deen being practiced. Things shut down with the adhan. Salah was practiced as a community. So that environment, it creates a different type of mindset. Not to say that people didn't make mistakes or fabricating the deen, but what I'm saying is that we have to learn how to regard and respect the scholars that came in the past. That's important. The scholars that came in the past, they practiced and they lived the deen. There was that reality that was there. And so sometimes you find that the madhab, the reason why people feel so much inclined to the madhabs the way that they do is because of that reason. Is because it's been a process that was in place for so long, and there's some trust. They trust in it, and because they trust in it, you know, they see that it has worked over time, and that trust relationship allow to grow. Whereas, like, we don't grow up with that type of mindset. We grow up with the mindset of being suspicious, being critical, and that's kind of what the spirit is of today's time. And that's why a lot of times we won't. We just look at this. In today's time, some people take up the madhabs as just going against the Quran and the Sunnah, which is not true. And so that was kind of like a summary of what came before. So something shifted. What you began to see is rivalry now, especially between Medina and Iraq in the history of the Madhabs early on. And so you have a methodological issue now where the people of Medina are being called the people of Hadith, and the people of Iraq are being called the people of juridical analysis or opinion or right, reason, the people of reason. In these names, there's an exaggeration, Ashabul Hadith, wa Ashabul Rai. There's an exaggeration because you know that people that are following Hadith, they have intellect. People that are following juridical methodology, or they're following analogy or ijtihad or opinion, they also have Hadith. Again, we painted a picture of the Imams and the early generation, showing that they were meticulous. They cared about the Quran and the Sunnah. But these methodological differences began to emerge, and they were there early on in the time of the companions. So even if you look at Ibn Umar and you look at Umar, their father's son, Ibn Umar, there's an account which reports that he walked in an area in which it was known that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ walked. And there was a branch, and that branch, the Prophet had bowed ﷺ under it. And he continued to walk. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu imitated the same act. Without asking why did he do it, the rationale for it, he just imitated it. The Prophet did it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I'm doing it. That was the mentality of Ibn Umar. That was the mentality of Ibn Umar. The Prophet did it, I'm doing it. I don't have to understand it. Umar was different. Radiallahu anhuma. Umar was different. Umar, he tried to understand why it is that certain things work certain ways in Islam. Ali, the same thing. Ibn Mas'ud, the same thing. Aisha, the same thing. Radiallahu anhum ajma'in. So you find the group of the companions, they're interested in understanding why. And a group of the companions, they're content with just practicing and staying at the literal meaning. And both trends existed. Eventually, when the madhabs develop and mature, they're also taking on that mentality, right? And so you find that there's this rivalry that becomes exaggerated, with people saying, well, my methodology is the right methodology. Your methodology is not right. And so you have, this becomes an issue of politics. Again, we said that the companions themselves had these different trends in how they dealt with things. One methodology was to look at the underlying cause to the ruling, the wisdom behind it, the logic behind it. The other methodology is to stay with the text at face value. In today's time, people like to judge one of those approaches, and they try to say this one is better than that one. That's not correct, in my opinion. You have these two approaches that were there with the companions, and they stayed there. And they're in our inheritance. This is why Imam Shafi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he used to be from the people of Hadith. And then what happened in that time period? What happened? He traveled and he went to Iraq. And in going to Iraq, he had to deal with the people of Rai, or the people of Ijtihad, or juridical reasoning, or opinion, as they were called. the people who deal with the whys behind the scene. That doesn't mean that the people of Hadith didn't deal with the whys behind the scenes. It's just they had the different technique. They wouldn't engage in hypothetical thinking so much. Their reasoning was a little different. They focused more on weighing harm and benefit versus creating scenarios, hypothetical scenarios of what if this took place, what if that took place, that type of situation. And that's what you found in Iraq. And Iraq was a different culture than Medina. Iraq was a place where it was a cosmopolitan type of place. It was a place that was multicultural, that had a lot of different ideas, different religions, different backgrounds versus Medina. Medina was the city of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Islam was dominant in it. The Islam was practiced in it. Islam came and reoriented it. So it was a different orientation. It was a place of the knowledge of revelation. The Quran was revealed in it. And so you find that Medina was a different environment. It was a place of the Sunnah. So Iraq had knowledge of the Sunnah and knowledge of the Quran as well, but it wasn't a place of revelation. And it wasn't a place where the Muslims were alone the whole time, just practicing. It was a place that had knowledge of the Sunnah because the companions had gone there. And so you find two different sets of circumstances, and you find two different orientations. And even the race issues were being dealt with, or the ethnic issues, not necessarily race so much, but they were being dealt with, like the issue of the Arabs and the Persians, or the Arabic tribes and the Persians. And you find some people had issues with Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi because he was Persian. The Persians, Iraq was a place which there was a fight for the deen. There was a little fight. Iraq was a place, it was one of the probably a few places in which you find that there was an actual fight for Islam, in the sense of what we call military intrusion. And so there was that tension between the early Muslim community and the Persians that were there. And that with time, it kind of, some people like to say that even in today's time, some of the issues that you see in today's time even stem from that type of rivalry, the Persian-Arab struggles. Some people have put fire to the fuel, put fuel to the fire with regard to that. But these environmental realities of rivalry, of tension, this comes in, and it also gives energy and fuel to the whole idea of my methodology, your methodology, right? So Imam Shafi'i, he traveled in that environment that was tense. He traveled to learn. So he went to Iraq after spending time in Mecca, Medina, and he was a student of Imam Malik. And so he goes to Iraq, and when he goes to Iraq, he encounters the people who are the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayhi. Imam Muhammad bin Hassan Shaybani also has studied with Malik. But Imam Shafi'i, it was known he was from the people of Hadith. So he's in a new hood now. He's in a new neighborhood and a new territory. He's in Iraq. So they're like, look at this guy coming. He's coming into our environment. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Now you have to conform to us, to our methodology. So Imam Shafi'i stayed with them for some time, and he went back and forth with them. And then he learned their methodology. And so you found that in the Shafi'i Madhab had integrated the tensions. And many of the ulama began to integrate the tensions, reconcile between them, between the usage, the whole concept of employing hadith and employing reason, and how do you bring those two things together. And that's why I said, like, the madhab, they have that value in that there's questions that they have dealt with and issues that they have dealt with. We deal with that issue in today's time, in which they reconcile these tendencies. They reconcile these tendencies and they make things clear for us. I hope that I'm being clear and not too out there. And so the whole thing of Ashabul Rai and Ashabul Hadith, or the companions of Hadith and the companions of opinion, it has its roots in the methodology of the companions, but it's also exaggerated with time due to political issues that are taking place in the Ummah. Rivalry, rivalry. And so, but the most important thing is that there is somewhat of a methodological position. So, Shah Wali Allah says, behold that during the time of Sa'id bin Musayyib, who was the most knowledgeable of the Tabi'een, Ibrahim al-Zuhri, and during the period of Malik and Sufyan, and even after them, there were people among the ulama who did not like getting involved in giving independent opinion on matters of the Sharia. Right. They were afraid of issuing fatwa and inferring, deriving, except in circumstances which were unavoidable. In other words, they didn't want to explain too much how it is that the Quran and Sunnah apply in new situations. They were mainly concerned with the reporting of hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Once Abdullah bin Masud was asked about something, to which he responded, and he said, I dislike making something lawful for which Allah has made unlawful for you, or making unlawful that which Allah has made lawful for you. Mu'adh bin Jabal radiallahu anhu, he said, O people, don't hasten to the trial before it descends, because among the Muslims there are always some people who, when asked about something, they begin explaining it in detail. In other words, let the situation be. Don't elaborate on it. Don't go into details with it. Just let it be. And so that's a certain type of mindset, what you take things as they come. And that was kind of the life in Medina. They would deal with issues as they came, right? They didn't engage in a lot of speculation and a lot of scenario building, that type of thing, because life didn't change much. There was not a lot of difference, and so on and so forth, in culture, in mindset, in people, in orientation. People kind of were on the same approach. Similar has been reported of Umar, Ali, Ibn Abbas, and Ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhum ajmain, with regard to their dislike of maintaining something that had not been revealed. So they were very adamant about following the Quran and the Sunnah as close as possible, and not going with secondary opinions, or not going with something which is an application, somebody's thought regarding how it is that the deen applies. Umar said to Jabir bin Zayd al-Azdi, you belong to the scholars of fiqh from Basra. Only give fatwa on the basis of what's clear in the Quran and the established Sunnah, because if you do something other than that, you would destroy yourself and others. Right? And we said Ibn Umar, that was his methodology. And the point of it is that the deen begins, we lose the focus. And this is what has happened with, sometimes we don't like to admit this, but this is the criticism of some of the madhab, that people became focused on the study of what the madhabs have said, and that became the priority over being familiar with the Quran and the Sunnah directly. That doesn't mean that the madhab are not focused on the Quran and the Sunnah, but the madhab are focused on the Quran and the Sunnah in other things as well. And so it's like you find this, they were cautious in how far they went away from familiarity, study of the Quran and the Sunnah. And so that's one of the reasons why they had, for instance, you find in the example of the companions, they would recite, some of them would finish the Quran in 3 days, some of them in the whole month, some of them in between that. And so you found that they had a regular reading. Find Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi, he had a session. He had a session in the masjid of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, in which he recited hadith. And you find that they were very familiar, unlike many of us, very familiar with the Quran and the Sunnah. Very, very, very familiar with the Quran and the Sunnah. And so even if they knew the opinions of Umar and Ali and the other scholars, they were very familiar with the Quran and the Sunnah. It had a centrality. And that's kind of the message that Ibn Umar was sending, that look, you're going to an environment in which people speculate on issues. You're going into an environment in which there's differences already between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. You're going into an environment in which, people, they like to focus on hypothetical situations. They like to derive from the Quran and the Sunnah. You stick to what the early generation focus on. Although, like I said, it's understandable. When situations arise, things may not be clear in the Quran and the Sunnah. They have to be researched in the Quran and the Sunnah. Everything is not just black and white. But in any event, the advice of Ibn Umar here is a lesson for us. It's a lesson for us in that in environments in which are multicultural, in environments in which you have a clash of methodologies, even you have fabrications, you have lies, you have a number of different challenges. Familiarity with the Quran and the Sunnah becomes an imperative. That's aside from studying what the Madhabs have said, what the scholars have said. That's aside from that. But if you know the dawah of late, within the last 2 decades, some of it has not been worth much. Some of it has been awesome. But there's also been a lot of confusion, a lot of rivalry, a lot of back and forth, which set us back as a community. And so those are the things that Ibn Umar, is kind of pointing to. Like, look, just focus and practice, right? And so, we have made we have made the dawah. Alhamdulillah is correcting itself now, but with the help of Allah. But we have made the dawah a point of differing, and that's not correct. We know that understanding differences requires methodology. So Abu Nasir says, when Abu Salama came to Basra, Hassan al-Basri and I went to see him. He asked Hassan, "Are you Hassan? No one in Basra is dear to me than seeing you, and that is because I have been told that you give fatwa on the basis of your own opinion. Don't give fatwa on the basis of your own opinion. Give fatwa only if it is on the basis of the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the revealed book, the Quran." Muhammad ibn al-Munkadir, radiallahu anhu, he said, "The scholar steps into what is between Allah and his servants. Therefore, he should find his way out as well." Basically, the idea here is that it's like Imam Ibn al-Qayyim is saying, is like scholars are taking a massive responsibility and they're talking for the deen almost as if they're talking for Allah and for the Messenger. That's why it's very dangerous. May Allah protect everyone. As Sha'bi was asked, "What did you do when you were asked about something?" He replied, "You have come to the right person who is familiar with the matter." Usually when the man was asked about something, he would refer to his colleague saying, "Give them fatwa," and the question would remain rotating until it would come back to the first. That's the attitude of caution, that people didn't want to talk on the deen, so they would ask someone that was knowledgeable. So a knowledgeable person would be asked a question, then that person would pass the question on to someone else, and you find that was the practice of the companions. Consequently, the recording of hadith and athar and the writing of books and transcripts became quite widespread in Islamic countries. It was rare for a narrator not to record hadith or write a book or have a copy of it, and this became one of their main preoccupations. Why? Because look at the statement of Sha'bi. "Take what they relate to you from the Messenger of Allah and throw in rubbish what they tell you of their own opinion." These traditions, including the last one, are related by Imam al-Darimi. Imam al-Darimi was a scholar of hadith. So basically he's saying, as a Imam Shawali Allah is saying, as a consequence of how the scholars were thinking, hadith and athar became recorded, and a great man witnessed, this trend and this movement in the Hijaz, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Khorasan, and different places. People began to look and search for ahadith and the statements of the companions, and preserved them. And so now you had this movement that came, that's now the movement, and I'll end with that, the movement of codifying the hadith. So before we talked about how it was that the madhahib were codified and brought together and organized. Now what comes next is the imams in hadith. So we'll deal with that section, and then we'll stop with the insaf, and we're going to go back to the bidayat al-mujtahid. So I'll try to organize something first. So the last session that we have now is talking a little bit about how it is that the imams in hadith like Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, and them emerged. And part of their emergence is because of this push. People did not want the deen to just be rooted in the research of the scholars and the opinions of people. They wanted to make sure there was a separation between those opinions and what it was that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. And so that's what you find. And so now what comes next is the whole movement to codify the hadith. So the Quran is codified, the language is beginning to be codified, the statements of the scholars, and now hadith is coming next. And we end with that, inshallah. We ask Allah wa ta'ala to guide us, to forgive us, to strengthen us, to aid us, to protect us from all evil, and to give us an understanding of deen and allow us to die in the state of Islam and Iman. They claim that there's a claim, but I mean the whole relationship with Jafar al-Sadiq in Islamic scholarship, codifying is a systematic writing and recording and preserving of something. Tadween. Tadween in the Arabic language. So for instance, when they say, was the Sunnah written, were the Ahadith written in the time period of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Yes. But were they codified? No. It was preserved in memory, preserved in writing, but it wasn't systematized and organized in books in a systematic fashion. Was the Quran codified in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No. Was it written? Yes. It was codified. The Quran was codified in the time of Uthman. May Allah bless Uthman, because Uthman is not known as much for instance, like fiqh as Umar and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhum ajmain. But Uthman bin Affan radiallahu anhu, the greatest deed aside from any other good deed that he did, the greatest deed that Allah allowed him to do for this ummah is the preservation of the Quran in writing. Is the preservation of the Quran in writing. That's something that's very important. And so the Quran was codified in the time of Uthman, and that's why the script is called the Uthmani script. There's some original manuscripts still around in the dunya today. And you can find even on the internet pictures of the early manuscripts, massive, big parchments that contain the writing of the Quran. So we've come a long way as far as the Mus'haf is concerned. So that's the difference between writing and codification. As far as the study with Ahl al-Bayt, you find that it's not just Abu Hanifa. You find that the early Imams, this whole focus on Ahl al-Bayt, it becomes an issue of extremity. Either to deny a role to Ahl al-Bayt or Ahlul Bayt, and or it becomes an exaggeration to just focus on them 100%. The Quran, the beginning. That's why I said the issue compilation and codification are two different things, right? Compilation is just bringing the stuff, the materials together. Codification is the actual systematic, meticulous process of organizing, preserving, recording. Whereas compilation is like, I'm bringing these ideas together. I'm bringing ideas together, and I may have them. Okay, let me organize it a little bit, but it's not in the systematized form. The easiest book to read on that is Van Denford, Quranic Sciences, which is PDF online. That's the, you know, is the quick hit on it, on the topic, and it's clear language, it's to the point. Right? There's some things in Hadith preservation and also in the Quran that are confused, and it's unfortunate because the confusion in those areas leads to doubt for some people. So that's why it needs to be clarified. There's a difference between writing, compilation, and codification. The differences are very subtle. Yani kitabatul hadith, kitabatul Quran, jama'il Quran, tadween. That's that, because if you want to talk about compilation, there was multiple compilations of the Quran. That was an issue. The issue was the issue of actual codification and standardizing everything together. Van Denfer, VON, Denfer is DENFFER, I believe it is. If you type it up, it comes up. Quranic Sciences. His book actually taught it for Huda University in I think Islamic American University as well. It's a standard. I think even some of the other schools or universities, they use it. Yep, yep. Ahmed van Denver. Sheikh Mustafa Al-Azami has a book as well, which talks about the preservation of the Quran in comparison to other books, and that's online too, PDF. So we'll end with that. So some of the things that we talked about, we're not going to get into that with a lot of depth at all. Is the whole issue of the, this later part of this session brought up the issue of writing and compilation and codification. That stuff, we need to chat about that. We need to chat about that stuff because in your study of the history of the Quran and the history of the Madhab and the history of Hadith or the history of the Sunnah, it's very important as a student to be grounded in understanding those things well, although there seem to be boring facts. Because if you don't have an understanding, a historical understanding of these things, remember that recently, within the last few years, in the UK, they tried to say that they had the oldest copy of the Quran. Before that, the Princeton scholars, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, both Orientalists, they found some manuscripts in Yemen, and they tried to say that the Quran was fabricated. For you and me, we're like, yeah, right. But 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if we don't teach properly, the argument will be raised again. And with people that are not grounded in the deen, at least in their knowledge of Islam, what do I mean? You can have people that have knowledge of Islam, but they may not be practicing at the best that they can be practicing. But they don't have doubt about Islam. They have issues with their desire, issues with implementing the deen. But they're not going to doubt about the authenticity of the Quran. They're not going to doubt about Hadith and so on and so forth. So, in a few generations, you may have people that may consider those arguments pretty entertaining, that the Quran was fabricated, this, that. So it's important for us to understand the history of. They do that with a hadith. Some people, they will argue you down. Say, I only follow the Quran, or I only follow Bukhari. All these are hadith fabricated. How can we know the hadith are, true or false? That's because they're thinking with their experience in their mind. They don't know that there's a science. That's not happening. That's not happening to the last day. The knowledge of the Quran will not be happening. The loss of the knowledge of the Quran will not be happening to the last day. Yeah, the issue comes up. The issue comes up more. Sorry, I just got a text from a client, so that kind of disturbed me. The the issue. That's another point. I wanna make this point really fast. The students, we have to prepare ourselves. People come to us for help. They come for advice. They come for counseling. They come for support. Whatever it is. There's two sides to that. One is positive, one is negative. Sometimes people lie. We get into issues, personal life stuff, people fabricate. The other side is that if we're authentic and we are invested, those people will stay with us. Like the client right now, she's not going to see this because she doesn't watch the videos. But, I walked with her while she was going through a domestic violence situation. And it was rough. There was drug usage and this and that. And she's not a convert. She's a born Muslim. Big family of Muslims. But sometimes people, in other words, don't be a person that's just a person of a book. Don't be a person that's just a person of a book. You have the human side and prepare yourself, learning counseling skills. Even like we mentioned today, the methodology of understanding the differences gives you insight into how to deal with people. And you kind of can weed through conversations and so on and so forth. Islamic sciences, when they're understood properly, you can apply them in other scenarios, and it's scientific. It's scientific. So don't have shame in that. But in any event, we'll drop it. We'll drop the conversation here because a lot of these things need classes in order to expand on them. The issue of codification, the issue of compilation, the issue of writing, all that needs classes. And then some of the other stuff, it needs history lessons, and still needs to refresh on. We need to refresh on usul as well when it comes to some points and differences of opinion, like the issue that Aliyah brought up when it comes to tafsir of the Quran. That's important. I'll tell you why. Recently, I had a class a few weeks back, and I was mentioning Surah Al-Asr. The meaning of Asr is dahr, the ages and time, unrestricted. And a brother comes and says, my teacher told me something else. Fine, no problem. I told them the principle in that is that if both opinions are understandable, how you interpret the word asr, there's no tarjih in the Quran when it comes to that. If the language can facilitate it and there's a solid proof, there's not one opinion that's going to cancel out the other opinion. Right? And so just a messenger. Rayhan. So that's the issue that sometimes we don't understand methodology, and that's because we're not studying systematically. All of these things, all of these topics, our knowledge sections are points of interest, points of research in and of themselves. Right? And so we'll leave it with that, inshallah, and we can continue any questions on the internal chat. Okay, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh wa nastaghfirullah wa natubu ilayh.